Hello and welcome to Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflicts, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. This is your host, Michael Shurkin, filming in what very much feels like my secret lair in an undisclosed location in Washington, D.C. In case you're wondering who I am many things. I have a history PhD from Yale. I worked at CIA for a while. I worked at the Rand Corporation. And now I do various things, usually generally dealing with security in Europe and Africa and the Middle East. What I want to do today is I want to focus, though, purely on military strategy, and I want to introduce you all to one of the greats of modern military strategy, Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Now, for those of you who don't know who Foch is, and I'm looking at you Americans, Foch was the commander of the French army in 1917-1918. World War I. He also was the Supreme Allied Commander in 1918, which meant that all the Allied armies were under his direct command. And while by and large, or generally, it's absurd to say that in a war as large and complex and as long as World War I was, that any one commander deserves credit for victory. However, if you were forced to pick one guy, Ferdinand Foch would be, I think, an obvious choice. Among other things, he was the mastermind of the Allied strategy that finally broke the German army's back in the summer and fall of 1918. Now, Foch also, before the war, was both a professor at the French Army's War College and also the director of the Army's War College. And today, the director of the French Army's Doctrine Center, under which its War College is sort of attached, literally sits at Foch's desk. While he was a professor, or the director, I'm not actually sure which, but he wrote a book called On the Principles of War. This book is the cornerstone of French military strategy and doctrine. It's cited everywhere. It's still in print. His influence is everywhere. His language is everywhere. Often French officers today are even unconscious of the fact that they are standing on Foch's shoulders, and that the terminology they use, the way they think about things, sort of ultimately comes from Foch. So Foch's DNA is readily detectable in contemporary French strategic and doctrinal publications. The best way to do this and to introduce you to Foch is to talk about his principles of war, and I'm going to try to make this very brief. I think it's Oscar Wilde who said that brevity is the soul of wit, which of course always makes me think of Dorothy Parker's line about how brevity is the soul of lingerie. But anyways, I digress. The first thing that needs to be said is that Foch believed in principles of war. So the notwithstanding technological developments, so the idea is that if you study history and if you analyze military history critically, you can deduce from it eternal principles. And he was very well aware of the fact that the modern battlefield was changing. I mean, he certainly knew this already in 1903 because he could look around him and see what was going on, but it's certainly in World War I. And during the editions of the book that came out during the war, he wrote new prefaces. And in those prefaces, he said exactly that. He said, look, I understand that the battlefield has changed. On the other hand, these eternal principles still remain valid. Foch, you see, I've been talking a lot about both lately. So Foch believed that strategy boiled down to maneuver. But the maneuver had to be for the sake of setting up a decisive attack. And this is important because when he looks at military history, he says that before the French Revolution, military commanders would fight like fencers, because when you're fencing competitively, your goal isn't to kill your opponent, it's just to score points, right? Obviously, it's not a blood sport. Napoleon changed all this because Napoleon fought to kill and he maneuvered to kill. And Foch believed that he could teach people to maneuver to kill. It's just a question of understanding how you do it and applying these principles of war. It should not be mechanical, right? It's not about following rules. And his catchphrase was said to have been "De quoi s'agit-il?", which means what's it all about? And the idea is that commanders are supposed to assess the situation, assess the context they're in, and apply the principles of war given that context, right? You adapt. You need to be flexible, you need to be creative, and you need to adapt. Contemporary French military treatments of Foch associate him with three principles, which probably are what most French officers would say today if you ask them, what are Foch's principles of war? They would say economy of force, concentration of efforts, which sometimes is, you find it as concentration of means, or concentration of force. And the third one is liberty of action. Now, this is more or less accurate, but the reality is it's actually a distillation of what Foch said. So the problem is that Foch, for all of his greatness and the influence of this book, was actually a terrible, terrible writer. So for instance, one would think that somewhere in this book, he would lay out, like point by point, these are the principles of war, right? Boom, 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 like in bullet point fashion. He doesn't actually do that. So you have to deduce it from his book, and thus the book begs simplification. This is so readers end up extracting from certain things, and then it gets distilled down. So thus it was distilled down to these three principles of war. So the question is, what did he actually say? And he identified the following as principles. So you have economy of force, concentration of means, intellectual discipline, which associates with liberty of action. You also have security, or perhaps it's best to use the French word sûreté, which really has no direct translation in English. You also have strategic surprise, which goes in tandem with decisive attack. So let's start with economy of force, because it's huge. Foch explained the concept of economy of force by using a Latin aphorism that you cannot hunt two hares at the same time. You have to make decisions. And elaborating on this idea, he said that economy of force was the art of dispersing one's efforts in a profitable manner and getting the greatest possible benefit out of the resources that one has. So it's about this calculus. I've got to disperse my efforts. I have to focus here but not there. And it's the act of figuring this out. What proportions do I allocate to this? What proportions do I allocate to that? That's economy of force. And of course, one also must be mindful of the corollary principle, which Foch never actually says specifically, which is concentration of efforts or concentration of force. So Foch, for instance, he calls it economy of force, but we today would read it as concentration. He says the principle of economy of force is the art of spending all of one's resources at a certain moment, at a certain point, of applying to that point all of one's troops, and for this to be possible, of keeping them always in communication with one another, rather than compartmentalizing so that they're not operating together. You can't disperse them too much. And then when you need to, then they converge in the attack. Now, he says that this approach is also the secret to taking down a larger army. One only needs superior numbers at a specific point in time, right? And the idea is that you only target those places where you have that advantage, and you avoid fighting on all the other areas. So he cited Napoleon. He said, when with fewer forces I was under the presence of a large army that threatened to overwhelm mine, I felt like thunder on one of its wings and knocked it over. I then profited from the disorder that this maneuver never failed to create in the enemy's army to attack another part, always with my force. I fought him piece by piece, and the victory that resulted was always, at that moment, the victory of the larger force over the smaller. The next principle, and two principles which are in tandem, are intellectual discipline and liberty of action. Now, this concept of intellectual discipline is this idea that subordinate officers should be entrusted with the authority and the responsibility to figure out on their own how to achieve a certain objective. So the idea is the commander explains to them their intent, but leaves to these subordinate officers how to actually do it. And that these officers have to have the discipline to know that. Like, it's their job to figure out how you actually do it. And they need to do it while being mindful of the fact that they must fulfill the will of their commanders, but not with blind obedience, not with passive obedience, which with Foch disdain, but also they need to know that they don't know better than their superiors. They should not take it upon themselves to go after an objective that does not align with the commander's intent. They have to understand their role in the larger picture. So that's what he means by intellectual discipline. And the idea, of course, is that all of these subordinates have to have a degree of liberty of action. They need to be free to figure out and to act, to respond to changing circumstances, to respond to enemy actions, etc. The next principle is security, or sûreté. And the analogy the Foch draws is that when you go into a darkened room or darkened house, you stick your hand out, right? You're groping around because you don't want to trip over something. You don't want to bump into something and break your nose or something like that. Now, in military terms, this hand that you're sticking out, this is your avant-garde. This is the avant-garde. You also have to have like flanking forces. You have to have forces around you. And the idea is that they bump in the dark. They bump into things, the enemy. They, exercising their intellectual discipline and their liberty of action, figure out how to respond, right? Because maybe it's best to just go around it, or to duck, or to dodge, or to fight and hold the ground, or to attack. They need to be able to make that decision based on the circumstances, but also based on their understanding of the larger picture. What is their function supposed to be? And generally speaking, their function is preserving the body, the gros, right, which he uses, the French word, the larger force, from being forced to act in a certain way. So if you bump up or you against something, or if you trip right in the dark, now you have to react. You no longer have liberty of action. You're going to fall. You need to stick out your arm. You need to do certain things to respond to that. That's really, really bad in military terms. The idea is that when you see an obstacle, you should have enough time to figure out what to actually do, right? Thus you can exercise your liberty of action. Maybe I don't want to engage. Maybe I need to go around. Maybe I need to get out of here. There are all sorts of things that you can do. But the worst thing is to be forced to do something, because you're taken by surprise. You bump into something inadvertently. And for the security also, the idea is that this forward force can't be too far forward, because if it's too far ahead, it can't communicate to you in time what you need to know to figure out what to do. And also, or you can't communicate to all the other bits of you, right, so that you could everybody respond in a coordinated fashion. And also, it can't be too close. So if you're stumbling around a darkened room, it doesn't really help if instead of keeping your hand out here, you keep your hand out here, because that's not going to help you. That won't save you from tripping over something or bumping into a wall. You're still going to break your nose. So it's got to be like an appropriate distance, because of course that commander needs to understand what their job is in the larger scheme of things. Next comes strategic surprise and decisive attack, which again he discusses in tandem. They're closely related. Foch, like everyone since Clausewitz at least, spoke of the need for decisive battles, and usually that's understood to mean destroying the enemy's army. However, for Foch, that's not exactly true. What he's interested in is the psychological effect of a surprise. So when you surprise somebody, they're forced to react in a certain way. You deny them the liberty of action. And if you surprise them with a surprise attack, then you can force them into action through some combination of terror and paralysis, like, oh my God, or I don't know what to do. They're going to have to respond in some way. According to Foch, you don't actually have to destroy the enemy army. You don't have to kill the enemy. You don't even literally have to surprise them. The idea simply is to impose upon the enemy a feeling of powerlessness that he says is analogous to being surprised. And then once you do that, like once that the enemy is kind of forced and paralyzed, then if you so choose, you can then attack with your decisive force. This is what you do. So all of this put together basically means working to disperse your forces in the correct way, thoughtfully, understanding the situation, adapting to it, knowing how to act decisively, because you have to act decisively. You have to aim for that killing blow. And you're going to do that through some combination of maneuver, and also by using sûreté to make sure that you're not caught by surprise by your opponent. Your opponent does not deny you your own liberty of action. One rule, he says, it's sort of a golden rule for Foch, is to just keep attacking. You have to attack. And he says, of all mistakes, one alone is infamous, and that is inaction. He thinks this is important. In the book, he actually says it twice. He uses the same sentence in two separate sections of the book. Thank you. With that, I'll conclude my discussion of Foch. There'll be plenty more later. Please like and subscribe. Also, please feel free to subscribe to my Substack, Pax Americana, link in the description. Check out my website, michaelshirkin.com. Also, come find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you very much.